So my background involves licensure laws, and I give a lot of talks on this topic, and I title my talk, Controlling the Message by Controlling the Messengers, all right? And so the background on the situation is that I got involved in healthcare. It was a midlife career transition. And because, the long story about how it happened, but the bottom line is that I knew when I got in the healthcare business that a lot of what went on in healthcare was not right. So I came at it from a different point of view. And my focus initially was nutrition. It broadened to be informed medical decision making. And that's what my company does, by the way. We help people sort out risks and benefits in terms of how to proceed with screening tests and drugs and procedures and diets and supplements and anything healthcare related. But at the time that this all began, I had a pretty narrow nutrition focus and no idea how onerous the government could be in the United States. And I knew nothing about licensure laws. So in the US, we license a handful of healthcare professionals, and then we basically give them control over their domain. So in the case of nutrition, it's dietitians who are licensed in 40-some states. And the laws have been chipped away at. In fact, I was very instrumental in getting one of the licensure boards disbanded in Michigan. But my story starts in 1996, very shortly after I opened my business in the healthcare field. And I got a phone call from the Ohio Board of Dietetics. And being so naive at the time, it was almost like the government is here to help me. And I was so cooperative and friendly and answered their questions and hung up. And I thought, oh, we've got that all straightened around. I should have been very nervous. And of course, today I would advise anybody who gets a call from the government, any branch, you should not talk to them. Well, a few weeks later, I get a phone call from the investigator. I didn't know that licensure boards had investigators, but they do. And the investigator said she wanted to come out to my facility and talk to me because they were very concerned about some of my activities. Now, the thing that's really important to know at this stage of the game is that my activities were very limited. This company was, I don't know, 8 weeks old or something of this nature. And we're doing workshops on health and nutrition and cooking classes. And we also showed this film that was produced by John Robbins called Diet for a New America. And so anyway, this woman comes out and we had a very unpleasant discussion during which she told me that showing the film Diet for a New America could actually be construed as the unlicensed practice of dietetics because showing the film might make somebody change their eating habits. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, if the United States Supreme Court says I can't show the film, then I'm going to stop. But until then, you and I have a big disagreement going on. So it got progressively unpleasant. And I made the comment I didn't understand why this had turned into such an acrimonious exchange. And at that point in time, she slams her pencil on or pen on the table. And she says, listen to me. She says, I'm not here to be your friend. You can think of me like the police. I'm an investigator for the state of Ohio. And she goes to all this posturing. I said, well, listen, I wasn't going to ask you to play golf tomorrow. I was just thinking, you know, civility would be nice. I'd never dealt with anything like this before. So I said, well, I think we're finished with this meeting. I said, you know, it's time for you to leave. And then we started a very long battle that went on for about 5 years and cost me $160,000 US. And basically what this was about was whether or not I was practicing dietetics without a license. And as it escalated, I started looking into this more, and I found out about licensure laws and how they are supposedly to protect the public, but are really turf and title protection laws to protect occupations. And I found out also the state of Colorado has what's called a Sunrise Commission. And this is an organization that looks into the logistics of a law before they even introduce it into one of the legislative chambers. And they had done an investigation to determine whether or not Colorado needed a licensure board. And during this time, they surveyed all the dietetics boards around the country, and I found out that Ohio had the most active dietetics board. They had gone after more people than all other states combined. So this was something systemic. So I got involved in politics, helped some people get elected, contributed to their campaigns, managed to finagle a meeting with the governor of the state, told him what was going on. And that came in very handy at a certain point in time because eventually subpoenas were issued for information that I refused to provide. One of the reasons being that they had asked for a list of everybody who had spoken at my center because they wanted to broaden the investigation into other people. So I just refused to do it. So there are laws in the state of Ohio and the United States that if you get a subpoena for information, you don't provide it. At a certain point in time, they put you in jail. And then you sit there until you provide it or until they determine you're not ever going to provide it, and then they turn you loose. So I come from a rather subversive family, and sat down with my parents and said, I think I'm going to jail for a good long time in a few weeks for this. And my parents said, don't you cave, you go sit there, we'll take care of everything, sign your checks over to us, and we'll, take care of everything. And so I was really prepared to do this, to go sit in jail if I needed to, because I wasn't going to turn anybody else in. They were using it as leverage. So at the last minute, some of the people who I was working on their campaigns got elected, and they happened to be at the governor's Christmas party. And one of them said to the then governor of Ohio, you know that story about Pam Popper and the dietetics board? Well, she's going to jail next month. And he goes, over this? He was incredulous. So the next day, his legal counsel called, and I brought all of the documents from my investigation down to the governor's office. And he looked through everything, and he called the dietetics board, and he said, you've got a couple of problems. He said, the first thing is you're actually turning her into a martyr. When she goes there, it's not going to be good for you. He said, the other thing is that she's helped a couple of people get elected who really understand what you're doing, and they're going to try to take you out. So we don't know exactly what happened, but they sent me a certified letter saying, don't practice dietetics. And we sent a letter back saying, we're not. And then they sent me a letter saying not to use PhD after my name because it might lead somebody to believe that I had expertise in dietetics. And we sent a letter back saying, well, we live in the United States and we have free speech, and so we're not going to comply with that. And then we never heard from them again. So that got me, that was the beginning of my understanding that there was a whole political aspect to healthcare. And that this is just one little piece of it, but it's an area that I took on myself, and I got some changes made in the state of Ohio. Worked on this licensure revocation in getting rid of the licensure board in Michigan, and helped to get language inserted into dietetics laws in several states, testified against dietetics laws, and so that's how I became involved in the subversive movement to tell the truth about nutrition, and later on, much bigger issues like the psychiatric drug issue and some of the things that Dr. Bregan talks about and Dr. Goethe talks about. So one of the things that people ask me all the time is why this licensure issue is so important. And if you go back to the very beginning of licensure, the best place to read about it, by the way, is Paul Starr wrote a book called The Social Transformation of American Medicine, and won a Pulitzer Prize back in 1984. And in that book, he details how the American Medical Association used licensure as a way to control medicine. And it was against the interest of people. If you go back to that particular point in time when this all started, the average postal worker in the United States made more than the average doctor. There was a glut on the market of doctors. They weren't particularly well respected. And so the AMA, I think some of it was well-intentioned, some of it was gaining control of medicine. But essentially what they did was to proclaim doctors as the individuals most qualified to determine whether or not some of the herbal remedies and lotions and potions that were common at the time were appropriate or not. So the AMA gained licensure through a lot of lobbying and political maneuvering for medical doctors. And the first thing they did was try to convince everybody that osteopaths were dangerous people, keep them out. Well, the osteopaths became very political, and they managed to get licensed. And so they joined with the American Medical Association. We got to make sure everybody knows chiropractors are dangerous, right? So the chiropractors actually filed a lawsuit against the AMA, and they proved that there was a systemic plot, really, to discredit chiropractic as a profession. They had hired public relations firms in New York to put false articles in publications to make sure everybody knew how dangerous chiropractors and chiropractic practice was. And so the chiropractors won a lot of money, and then they invested that money in licensure laws. And wouldn't you know, they join now with the medical doctors to make sure everybody knows naturopaths are very dangerous people. I subsequently, after all this, became trained as a naturopath. So if you go state by state and practice by practice, it has never been a group of citizens in any state who have showed up in a legislator's office and said, you know what, I really think it's important that we license dietitians because so much dangerous nutrition information is being given out. So let's introduce some laws and we'll put some safety nets in place so that people don't get the wrong information about nutrition or medicine or physical therapy or whatever it is. This is always trade groups who are going to legislators and saying, it's dangerous to let anybody practice this particular thing. So what we need to do is have standards. And it always sounds really good, but anytime you get a law passed, there's something called the law of unintended consequences. And this is all the stuff that follows that nobody ever really thought about. And in Ohio, back to my case, the legislator who introduced the dietetics law said he never, ever anticipated, because he heard about my case, that it would turn into this huge debacle and that it would have resulted in hundreds of people losing their businesses and that sort of thing. Never thought about all that. He just thought it was a good idea to have some regulations to regulate the practice of dietetics. So I want to come back to something I said earlier. When I started, I was talking about controlling the message by controlling the messenger. So these groups of dietitians, for example, in the United States, they have the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and there are other such organizations all over the world. There's a South African Association for Dietetics and that sort of thing. And what you see, which is really common, is that they all take money from big pharma, from drug companies and food and big ag, that sort of thing. Just like the doctors' organizations take money from the drug companies and the patient organization. Okay, so the professional associations do. And in return for that, it's never quite quid pro quo, but in return for the money they receive, they take stands in favor of industry. So for example, in the case of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, they take over $1.5 million a year from industry. The biggest donor is the Dairy Association, dairy management in the United States. You will never hear the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics say anything bad about dairy. They will always encourage its consumption, okay? So the point that I'm making is that if you're a drug company, if you're a food company, if you're an agricultural organization, what you want to do is you want to be supportive of organizations that will promote your products. And the fewer the number of organizations, the easier it is to do. So if you actually deregulated medicine, which has been done in one state in the United States, if you deregulated medicine and you said, listen, with certain parameters, we're going to let anybody talk about healthcare issues who wants to talk about healthcare issues, as long as disclosures are made about what the training is and limitations on what you can do, like a nutritionist shouldn't be taking out a patient's appendix on the dining room table. I mean, we can all agree to put some safety standards in place. But when you do that, what you have is a lot of independent thinking. You have a lot of contrary ideas coming to the table all the time. You can't control the message that gets out quite so much anymore. So not only is it good for the practice groups to limit who can be in the healthcare business, but it's very good for the organizations that fund the practice groups, because the target for marketing your message, very easy to identify, remains a relatively small number of people compared to the others who might join the party if they were allowed to talk about healthcare-related issues. And so this is good for industry, very good for protecting occupations and turf and title, not very good for consumers. And I can show you, I actually have minutes of meetings, and I have slide sets that have been used at National Association meetings, both for the AMA, for the Dietetics Association, the Nursing Association. They all do this, where they talk about the importance of protecting their profession from competition. Well, we all know what happens when you protect organizations from competition. The message is very clear. It may not be very good for the consumer, but the lack of choices becomes very, very good for certain protected interests. And that's why this goes on. And that's always what we're up against when we go to change these licensure laws, is first of all, the perception of safety. The second thing is the ability to present our educational pathway is the best, and no others count. And then a lot of industry backing. So the A&D in the United States can have almost unlimited funds to protect itself in various states, whereas somebody like me coming at them, I don't have unlimited funds. Maybe someday I will. I would be much more dangerous if I was better funded, for sure.